The air scrubbers on the survey ship Kestrel had never failed in 11 years of service. They failed in a way no one expected on the 9th day of the Drammen run, and they did not fail because they were broken. They failed because they did their job perfectly and carried the smell of a seared steak into every compartment on the ship. Nora Bell did not know any of this yet. She was standing over a hot pan with a pair of tongs, watching the edge of the meat turn from grey to brown to a deep, blistered gold. She liked this part. The sound was good. The smell was better. She had been saving the cut for 3 weeks, keeping it cold and quiet in the back of her locker, waiting for a day when the crew rotation gave her 4 uninterrupted hours in the galley. She got about 6 minutes. The first alarm was a soft one, a polite two-tone chime that meant a crew member had triggered a medical alert. Nora barely looked up. Somebody was always pulling a muscle in the cargo bay. The second alarm was not polite. It was the flat, ugly howl of a full-ship biological emergency, and it came with red light in every corner of the room. Nora turned off the burner. She stood there holding the tongs and thought, with real confusion, that something terrible must have happened somewhere else on the ship. In the crew lounge 2 decks up, an engineer named Velik had collapsed against a wall with his breathing filters clogged and his eyes streaming. Velik's people came from a world with thin, cold air and almost no volatile organic compounds in the atmosphere. He had never smelled anything stronger than machine oil in his life. What came out of the vent above him was a cloud of caramelized fat, burnt sugar, scorched protein, and roughly 400 separate chemical compounds produced by the violent application of heat to flesh. To Nora, it smelled like dinner. To Velik, it smelled like the inside of a fire, and his body responded the way any sensible body responds to the inside of a fire. 2 others went down before the ship's medical officer traced the source. A navigator from the HES systems started vomiting in the corridor. A junior scanner technician locked herself in a supply closet and refused to come out, convinced the ship was burning. The medical officer followed the readings backward through the ventilation system, deck by deck, until she arrived at the galley door and found a human woman in an apron holding a piece of meat. "Put it down," the medical officer said. Nora put it down. The quarantine order came 4 hours later, signed by a Concord health warden named Tepper, who was not even on the ship. She had read the incident report from a station 8 light years away and issued the order without asking a single question, because in her experience, the answers never changed anything. What changed was the inventory. Tepper arrived 9 days later with 2 assistants and a sealed scanning unit, and she went through Nora's pantry item by item, and the record of that search became, within a month, the most widely circulated document in Concord space. There was a hard block of something the scanner identified as an aged dairy product containing 3 separate species of living mold. Nora called it cheese. The scanner called it an active fungal colony. Tepper's assistant refused to touch it. There was a row of dried red pods that registered a defensive neurotoxin at concentrations high enough to blister the skin of every species on the Kestrel. Nora explained that the plant made the compound specifically to stop animals from eating it. Tepper asked why then humans ate it. Nora said because it was good. There was a leg of meat, cured and hung, that had been left in controlled decay for 18 months. There was a jar of vegetables submerged in brine and deliberately colonized by bacteria. There was a bottle of liquid produced by letting fruit rot in a barrel until it turned sour on purpose. There was a package of fish that the scanner flagged correctly as poisonous. Tepper held up the fish. "This will kill you." "Not if it's cut right," Nora said. "And if it is not cut right, then it kills you," Nora agreed. Tepper put the fish down very carefully. The report she filed ran to 60 pages and did not include a single accusation of malice. That was the strange part. Tepper was thorough and she was fair, and what she wrote was simply a list of everything she had found, along with the toxicity ratings, the microbial counts, and Nora Bell's own calm explanations of what each item was for. She recommended immediate restriction of human food practice aboard mixed-species vessels. She recommended a full review of human dietary tolerance. She recommended, in the last line, that the Assembly treat the matter seriously. The Assembly did not treat the matter seriously. The report reached the Concord floor on a slow legislative day, sandwiched between a shipping tariff and a water rights dispute, and a junior delegate read the pantry inventory aloud as a way to wake the room up. He got as far as the living mold before the first laugh came. He got to the deliberate rot, and the room broke open. When he reached the part where a human had explained that the poison in the pod was the reason for eating it, 400 delegates from 400 worlds laughed until the chamber's acoustic dampeners engaged automatically. It became a joke, not a cruel one at first, just a joke, the kind of thing you told at a dock bar when the conversation ran dry. Did you hear what the humans eat? They eat the mold, on purpose. They eat rot and call it flavor. They take a plant that spent 1,000,000 years learning how to poison things, and they put it on bread. Within a month, there were 11 separate comedy routines about it circulating on the entertainment channels. Within 2 months, there was a children's song. Nora Bell learned about the song from Velik, who came to the sealed galley door 6 weeks after the incident with his filters properly fitted, and stood there awkwardly for a while before he said anything at all. "They are laughing at your people," he said. Nora was scrubbing a pan she was no longer allowed to use. She thought about it. "I know," she said, "let them." She did not say it bitterly. She said it the way a person says something they have decided not to spend energy on. Velik did not understand. He would not understand for another 2 years, and when he finally did, he would be standing in a field on a dying world with a bag of salt in his hands. For now, he just stood at the door. "What did it taste like?" he asked. "The thing that made me sick." Nora stopped scrubbing. "It tasted," she said, "like something worth cooking." There is a room on the Concorde's central station where species go to be corrected. It has no official name. The delegates call it the small chamber, though it is not small, and everyone who has ever been summoned there understands that the summons is not an invitation to argue. It is an invitation to agree quickly and go home. Humanity was summoned to the small chamber 11 months after the Kestrel incident. Ambassador Olan had prepared for this the way he prepared for everything, which was carefully and without hope of surprise. He was a tall insectoid from a world of long negotiations, and he had spent 40 years learning the exact shape of a graceful surrender. He had a statement drafted. The statement acknowledged that human dietary practice had caused distress. It agreed to the adoption of standard nutrient protocols aboard all mixed vessels. It thanked the Assembly for its patience. He did not get to read it, because the human delegation brought a scientist instead of a diplomat, and the scientist did not come to apologize. Dr. Sami Rao was 46 years old and had spent her career in a field that nobody respected, which was the comparative study of what different species could survive putting in their mouths. She had 2 assistants, 1 data slate, and no prepared statement. She walked to the center of the small chamber, looked up at 400 delegates who had been laughing about her people for the better part of a year, and began not with a defense, but with a number. "Human stomach acid," she said, "sits at a pH of 1.5. The chamber waited. For comparison, she said, the average across this assembly is 4.2. The most acidic member species present is the Draman at 3.1. Ours is closer to what you would find in a scavenging animal. It is closer to what you would find in something that eats carrion off the ground and does not get sick." A delegate near the front asked, reasonably, whether this was meant to be impressive. "No," Rao said, "it is meant to be explained. That is the whole of my testimony. I am not here to tell you our food is safe. It is not safe. I am here to ask why our bodies are built for it." She put the first chart up. It was a simple thing, a horizontal bar for each member species showing the range of substances that species could consume without injury. Every bar was short, most were very short. The HES could tolerate a narrow band of engineered proteins and nothing else. Velik's people could handle 4 base compounds. Teppa's species, which was considered unusually robust, managed 9. Then Rao added the human bar, and the chart had to rescale itself to fit it. The silence that followed was not the silence of people who were impressed. It was the silence of people doing arithmetic. "We process ethanol," Rao said, "which is a cellular poison, in quantities that would kill any of you, because we have an enzyme most of you lack. We process the alkaloid in that red pod you have all been laughing about, because our nerve receptors register it as heat rather than damage. We eat food at temperatures that would cook your tissue from the inside, because our mouths and throats evolved a tolerance yours never needed. We consume live bacterial cultures from infancy, deliberately, and it does not make us ill. It makes us stronger, because our immune systems are trained the way a muscle is trained, by being asked to do difficult things over and over until difficult things become normal." She turned to face the upper gallery. "Now I want one of your own biologists to answer a question, not me, one of yours." A Concord xenobiologist was brought forward. She was old and slow-moving and clearly did not want to be there. Rao asked her one question: what kind of species develops these traits? The xenobiologist was quiet for a long moment. She was honest, which was unfortunate for the room. "A species that had no choice," she said. "Say more." "Those traits are expensive, biologically expensive. Acid that strong damages the body that makes it, an immune system that aggressive turns on its host. You do not evolve these things because they are pleasant. You evolve them because the alternative is starving." She looked at the chart. "This is not the profile of a species that had reliable food. This is the profile of a species that ate whatever it caught, wherever it caught it, in whatever condition it found it, for a very long time, and buried everyone who could not." Somebody in the back said, quietly, that this was still not a reason to bring the mold aboard a ship. Rao actually smiled at that. "No," she agreed, "it is not. The mold is culture, not biology. But I would ask you to think about where the culture came from. Every strange thing in that pantry report is a survival technology that got old enough to become a pleasure. We salt meat because salted meat does not rot, and now we salt meat because we like it. We ferment vegetables because fermented vegetables last the winter, and now we ferment them because they taste good. We cook with fire because fire kills what is in the food, and now we cook with fire because we cannot imagine eating any other way." She paused. "You are looking at 10,000 years of emergency measures that stopped being emergencies and turned into dinner." She sat down. The whole testimony had taken 19 minutes. The assembly did not know what to do with it. There was no accusation to reject and no request to deny. There was only a chart that nobody could argue with and a conclusion that nobody wanted to say out loud. Warden Tepper, who had filed the original report and had flown in specifically to defend it, found that she had nothing left to defend. She had written 60 pages describing a hazard. She had not once asked why the hazard existed. She spoke only once during the session, near the end, and what she said surprised the room. "I have no objection to the doctor's findings," Tepper said. "I object to the assumption that they are reassuring." Olan found himself agreeing and disliked himself for it. The vote went the safe way, as votes in the small chamber always did. Human cuisine was permitted aboard human vessels only, sealed storage, independent ventilation, no transport of human foodstuffs through Concord ports. It was a compromise that satisfied everyone in the room and solved nothing at all. Rao filed out with her data slate under her arm and her assistants behind her, and Olan caught up with her in the corridor because he could not help himself. "You did not apologize," he said. "No. You were supposed to apologize." Rao stopped walking and looked at him, and Olan would remember the look for the rest of his life, because it was not defiance, it was patience. "Ambassador," she said, "in about 2 years you are going to need to know all of this. I would rather you learned it now while it is funny." Then she went to catch her transport, and Olan stood in the corridor for a long time and did not know what she meant. A single grain of salt changed more Concord policy than 400 delegates ever managed, and it did so on a Tuesday in a galley by accident. The grain belonged to Nora Bell. The tongue belonged to Velik, who had been coming to the galley door for 8 months by then, first to ask questions and then simply to sit. The quarantine had been formally lifted after the hearing, replaced by a set of rules so detailed that Nora had them printed and taped to the wall. Sealed storage. Independent air, nothing served to a non-human crew member without written medical clearance. Velik had the clearance. He had spent 4 months getting it, filing forms with 3 different offices, and he had never told Nora why, because the reason was embarrassing. The reason was that he had smelled something once that had nearly killed him, and he had not been able to stop thinking about it since. Nora put the grain on a clean plate and slid it across the counter. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole thing, don't chew, just let it sit on your tongue." Velik looked at the plate. On it was a single white crystal roughly the size of a dust mote. His people had no word for salt. They had a word for the mineral, in the way one has a word for a rock, but they had no word for putting it in the mouth on purpose. He put it on his tongue. What happened next took about 4 seconds, and Nora watched all of it. She watched his eyes widen. She watched his breathing filters stutter. She watched him grip the edge of the counter hard enough that the metal complained. Then he started crying, and Nora went for the medical kit. "No," Velik said. "No, stop. It does not hurt." "Then what is it doing?" He could not answer for almost a minute. When he did, his voice was strange. "It is not doing anything," he said. "That is the problem. It is not nutrition. It has no energy in it. It does nothing for the body at all." He touched his own mouth as if it belonged to someone else. "So why can I feel it? Why is there a whole shape to it? Why does it have a beginning and a middle and an end?" Nora leaned on the counter. She had never once in her life had to explain what salt was for. "Because it tastes good," she said. "We do not have that," Velik said. "Do you understand? We do not have that. We have full and not full. We have safe and not safe. I am 106 years old, and I have never once eaten something because I wanted to." Nora did not have a reply. She made him sit down, and she got him water, and after a while he asked her very quietly whether there was more. There was a great deal more. Dr. Rao heard about the incident 4 weeks later and immediately dropped everything else she was doing. What she built over the following year became known as the palette maps, and they were the most disturbing scientific documents produced in the Concorde in a century, mostly because they were not about danger at all. They were about range. The maps plotted every Concorde species along 2 axes. The first was survivable intake, meaning everything a body could process without injury. The second was detectable variation, meaning everything a body could distinguish between. On the first axis, humans occupied a band roughly 9 times wider than the assembly average, which everyone already knew from the hearing. On the second axis, humans occupied a band that made the chart look broken. The galactic norm was between 4 and 11 distinguishable food sensations, not flavors, sensations. Most species could tell whether a substance was nourishing, whether it was foreign, whether it was too hot, and whether it was making them sick. That was the full instrument. Humans could distinguish, conservatively, 10,000. They did not evolve tongues, Rao wrote in her summary. They evolved laboratories. But the finding that broke the assembly open was not in the numbers. It was in the behavior. And Rao gave it a name that entered 11 languages within a month. She called it benign masochism. It described, she wrote, the human habit of deliberately seeking out sensations the body interprets as threat, precisely because the body is capable of overriding the interpretation. A human eats a compound that signals burning, feels the alarm go off, knows the alarm is false, and enjoys the alarm. A human eats something bitter, which every species in the galaxy reads as the taste of poison and calls it sophisticated. A human eats something sour, which is the taste of decay, and calls it refreshing. A human puts food in the mouth at a temperature the nerves report as injury and says it is best that way. No other species does this, Rao wrote. Not one, because no other species can afford to be wrong. The human palate is the palate of an animal that has been wrong about food 10,000 times and survived it, and therefore learned to treat the warning system as a source of entertainment. The Assembly's response was to reclassify the report as restricted. Then someone leaked it, and then it did not matter what the Assembly had classified. Because by that point, the salt was already moving. It started with dock workers on the Drammen line, who traded a sealed gram of it for a week of shifts. It moved to a station cook on the Hesse route, who figured out that a human seasoning, diluted by a factor of 10,000, was survivable for her species, and produced something none of her people had a word for. It moved to a mid-rank Concord officer who paid 4 months of salary for a jar of fermented vegetables and ate 1 sliver of 1 leaf a day, alone in his quarters, and did not tell anyone. Within 18 months, there was a black market across Concord space, and it did not deal in weapons or in restricted technology. It dealt in flavor. The prices were absurd. A gram of salt went for more than a gram of refined ship metal. Dried pods, ground to 1/100th of human strength, moved through 6 jurisdictions in sealed diplomatic pouches. There was a shipment of aged cheese seized at a Drammen port that was valued, in the customs report, at the price of a small freighter, and the customs officers who seized it did not destroy it, which was itself a scandal that ended 2 careers. Ambassador Olin read the enforcement reports every week and grew steadily more uneasy, though he could not say why. He was not troubled by the smuggling. Smuggling was old and boring. He was troubled by what the smuggling revealed, which was that 400 civilizations had built a food system so perfectly optimized for safety that not one of their citizens had ever tasted anything. He requested a transfer to human liaison duty. It was approved without comment because nobody else wanted it. His first posting brought him aboard a human station, where a cook served him a bowl of clear broth calibrated by a xenonutritionist to his exact tolerance. It had almost nothing in it, a trace of salt, a single dilute compound from something that had once been a root. Olin was a diplomat of 40 years standing, and he sat in a public dining hall and could not speak for some time. Later, he wrote in his private log a sentence that would be quoted at his funeral. "We spent 900 years making food that could not hurt us," he wrote, "and in doing so we made food that could not reach us either." The Vorash had never fired on a city. In 400 years of expansion, they had taken 11 civilizations, and not one of those civilizations had lost a single building to enemy fire. This was recorded in the Concord archives and had been studied by every military academy in settled space, and the conclusion had always been the same: the Vorash could not be fought because the Vorash did not fight. They arrived at the edge of a system, released something too small to see, and waited. The something was an organism. It was engineered, though it did not look engineered, and it had one function. It found synthesized nutrient stock and it colonized it. It did not poison the stock in any dramatic way. It simply grew inside it and rewrote its molecular structure into something that a body could no longer break down. Perfectly clean, perfectly sterile, perfectly useless. 11 civilizations had starved to death, surrounded by full warehouses. The 12th attempt began on a Concord border world called Halden Reach, and it went exactly to plan for 19 days. Halden Reach fed 4 million people from 6 synthesis plants. That was normal, that was efficient. A single strain of engineered algae, grown in vats, processed into the standard nutrient brick, distributed on a schedule so reliable that the citizens of Halden Reach had a word for the delivery hour and no word at all for hunger. It was the safest food system in the sector. It had been certified 9 times. Warden Tepper herself had signed 2 of those certifications. The organism reached the first vat on a maintenance worker's glove. By day 6, all 6 plants were compromised. By day 9, the bricks coming off the line looked identical, smelled identical, and passed every visual check, and were as nutritionally useful as sand. By day 12, people were collapsing in the streets with full stomachs. There was no backup. There had never been a reason for a backup. There was nothing else on Halden Reach that a Halden body could eat. The native plants were foreign protein. The soil bacteria were foreign. The animals, such as they were, had never been considered food by anyone because food came from vats and had always come from vats and would always come from vats. Warden Tepper was on the 4th relief transport in. She had insisted, and nobody had argued, because she had certified the plants and it was understood that she would want to see. What she found was a clean, orderly, well-governed city, with no rioting and no looting and no crime, in which people were sitting down in their homes and quietly dying of starvation in front of full cupboards. That was the part she could not get past. There was food everywhere. There was more food per person on Halden Reach than on any world in the sector, and every gram of it was the same gram, and the same gram had been broken. She filed a report that night that consisted of 4 words: "We built one door." The Vorash agent spread outward along the shipping lanes over the next 5 months. 9 worlds, then 14. The Concord response was the response any competent government makes to a biological weapon, which is quarantine, decontamination, and the emergency production of clean nutrient stock at unaffected facilities. It failed because the emergency stock was the same stock, and the organism found it as easily as it had found the first vat. Ambassador Olan sat in an emergency session and listened to a defense minister explain that the Concord had 11 months of survivable supply left across settled space, and that the figure assumed no further spread, and that the figure was optimistic. Then the agent reached Tolan Colony. Tolan was a human world. It was not an important human world. It had a population of 90,000, a mediocre spaceport, and an economy built on mineral extraction, and the Concord's own threat assessment had listed it as a probable total loss within 60 days. The organism arrived on schedule. It found the colony's synthesis plant, which supplied roughly 40% of the colony's calories, and it did to that plant exactly what it had done everywhere else. Within a week, the plant output was inert. Tolan Colony reported the loss, and then, from the Concord's point of view, did something inexplicable. It kept eating. There were fish in Tolan's shallow sea, and the humans had been eating them for 30 years, and the organism had no interest in fish. There were grain fields on the northern shelf, 4 different varieties planted in rotation, because that was simply how humans had always planted things, and the organism did not recognize grain. There were goats. There were mushrooms grown in the mine shafts by an old man who did it as a hobby. There were greenhouses, 11 of them, none of them official, all of them growing different things, because 11 different people had wanted 11 different things to eat. There was, in a warehouse near the port, 4 tons of salted meat and 1,100 sealed jars of vegetables in brine, held in reserve for no reason anyone could articulate, except that a human colony that does not keep a store of preserved food feels wrong to the people living on it. The Vorash weapon had been designed to destroy a food supply. Tolan Colony did not have a food supply. Tolan Colony had roughly 200 overlapping food supplies, most of them redundant, several of them technically illegal, all of them alive. But that was not the part that frightened the Vorash. The part that frightened the Vorash was what happened when the organism got into people. On the 14 Concord worlds it had touched, the organism had spread through populations as a secondary infection, and the mortality had been near total, because the immune systems it met had no history of anything like it. Those species had spent 9 centuries eating sterile food in sterile environments. Their bodies had never been asked a difficult question and did not know how to answer one. On Tolan Colony, 11,000 people got sick. They got very sick. 41 of them died, and the colony buried them, and that was a real and terrible thing to the people who did the burying. But the other 11,000 got better, because their immune systems had spent every year of their lives being trained by exactly this kind of insult, by soil on unwashed vegetables, by live cultures in fermented food, by the ordinary bacterial chaos of a species that had never once managed to keep its food entirely clean and had eventually stopped trying. The bodies on Tolan recognized the shape of the attack, not the specific organism, the shape of it. and they responded the way a trained fighter responds to an unfamiliar strike, which is badly, and then adequately, and then well. The Vorash had built a weapon that worked on fragile things. They had never met anything that was not fragile. The report came into Concord Central on a Thursday. Ambassador Olan read it twice, and then a third time, and then he sat very still for a long moment, and then he remembered a corridor 11 years earlier and a woman with a data slate telling him she would rather he learned it while it was still funny. He stood up in the middle of an emergency session, interrupting a minister mid-sentence, which in 40 years he had never once done. "Get the humans into the kitchens," he said. Nobody understood him. He said it again anyway. Nobody gave Nora Bell a rank. There was no rank for what she was asked to do, so the Concord invented a temporary designation, filed it under logistics, and stopped thinking about the paperwork, because by then the paperwork was the least of anyone's problems. She was 48 years old, and she had spent 22 years cooking on ships. She had been laughed at by 400 worlds. She was now standing in a hangar on Halden Reach, looking at 300 crates that contained no weapons, no medicine, and no nutrient stock of any kind. The crates contained seeds, salt, bacterial cultures in sealed tubes, dried starter for 11 kinds of fermentation, vinegar mother, cheese rennet, smoking chips, and 400 human cooks who had volunteered from every colony in settled space and who had been given 9 days of training in xenophysiology and no training at all in anything else. The first thing they had to teach was the hardest thing because it was not a technique, it was an idea. The idea was that food is not a product, food is a process, and the process can be run on almost anything. Halden Reach had a native root vegetable that grew wild across the northern plains. Every survey had classified it as inedible for the Halden people, and the classification was correct, because raw, it contained a compound that shut down their digestion within an hour. It had sat there for 200 years, growing in enormous quantities, 6 kilometers from a city where 4 million people were starving. Nora's team boiled it. That was the whole intervention. They boiled it, discarded the water, boiled it again, and the compound broke down, because that is what most compounds do when you apply enough heat for long enough. And this is a thing every human child learns without being told, and no Concord species had ever needed to know. A Halden nutritionist watched the second boil and asked, with real bewilderment, how anyone had discovered this. Somebody was hungry, Nora said, and somebody died finding out, and somebody remembered. The teaching spread outward faster than the Vorash organism ever had. Smoke, they taught, hang meat in smoke, and the smoke deposits compounds that stop rot, and it does not require power or sterilization equipment or certification, and it works in a shed. Salt, they taught, pack a thing in enough salt and nothing can live in it, including the things you are afraid of. Acid, they taught. Put a vegetable in brine, and the right bacteria will win the fight and make the environment hostile to everything else, and the vegetable will still be food in a year, and it will taste better than it did going in. Heat above all, they taught heat. Cook it properly. The Vorash organism, for all its engineering, was still an organism, and it denatured at 110 degrees like almost everything else in the universe. 9 centuries of Concord food science had produced sterilization systems of extraordinary sophistication, all of them dependent on power grids and supply chains and certified facilities, and every one of those systems had failed under blockade. A fire under a pot did not fail. Warden Tepper worked the Halden line for 6 months. She had come to observe. That lasted 3 days. On the 4th day she took off her inspector's coat and started hauling crates, and after 2 weeks she could gut a fish, and after 2 months she was running the Western distribution herself, and she was better at it than anyone because 30 years of health inspection had taught her exactly where a food system breaks. She found Nora one night behind the field kitchen, both of them too tired to talk, and said the thing she had come to say. "I wrote 60 pages about your pantry." "I read them," Nora said. "They were accurate." "They were accurate," Tepper agreed. "That is what I cannot get past. Every fact in that report was correct. The mold was alive, the meat was rotting, the fish was poison. I got every single fact right, and I understood nothing at all. She looked out at the lines of people waiting for a meal none of them could have named a year ago. I certified this world 9 times. I know. 1 strain of algae, 6 plants. I signed it 9 times and called it the safest system in the sector, and I was right, and it killed 400,000 people. Nora did not tell her it was not her fault, because Tepper would not have believed it, and because it was not entirely true. Rewrite the standard, she said instead. That's the only thing that helps. Tepper did. The revised Concord Food Security Framework ran to 200 pages, and its central requirement was 1 sentence long. No population shall depend on fewer than 9 independent food sources. It was called the Haldon Standard. Nobody ever called it the Tepper Standard, though everyone knew. The Vorash, meanwhile, did the only thing they could do, which was escalate. For 400 years, they had never needed a fleet. Now they built one, badly and quickly, and they threw it at the human relief convoys, because the convoys were the thing undoing them. It did not work, and the reason it did not work was not tactical. A Vorash blockade is a starvation weapon. It cuts a fleet off from resupply and waits, and the fleet either surrenders or dies, and this had always been true because every fleet in known space ran on synthesized stock delivered from certified facilities on a schedule. The human convoys carried live cultures. They carried seed. They carried on the larger ship's actual soil. A blockaded human relief fleet did not sit and wait to die. It grew things. It fermented. It kept 140 crew alive for 11 months behind a Vorash line on grain, fish protein, and a bacterial culture that a cook on the 3rd deck had been keeping alive, feeding daily, for 9 years, and which he referred to by name. You cannot starve out a supply chain that eats anything. The Vorash campaign did not end in a battle. It ended in arithmetic. They had built 400 years of strategy on the assumption that food was fragile, and the assumption had been true for every enemy they had ever met, and then it was not true, and the entire structure came apart. Their fleet withdrew. Their border collapsed inward over 2 years. Ambassador Olan negotiated the terms himself, and he was surprised by how little satisfaction it gave him, and by how much he found himself thinking about a bowl of clear broth in a human dining hall a long time ago. He asked the Vorash delegate, at the end, off the record, one question. 11 worlds, he said. How did you know it would work every time? The Vorash delegate was quiet for a while. Because it always had, he said. We had never met anyone who ate badly on purpose. Olan wrote that down. He read it back several times, and then he crossed out one word and wrote another above it. And what the archived copy says today is this. We had never met anyone who ate badly on purpose. We had never met anyone who ate widely on purpose. Underneath, in his own hand, Olan added a note that made it into the final treaty preamble by accident, because a clerk transcribed the whole page. They are not stronger than us, it read. They are simply harder to close. 11 years after a piece of meat set off a biohazard alarm on a survey ship, the Concord Assembly met to decide what to call humanity. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. The Concord's classification system determined trade weight, defense obligation, voting share, and every other practical measure of what a species was worth, and humanity had entered as a minor member with the lowest tier available. There was now a motion on the floor to move them to the highest. Dr. Sami Rao was 57. She had been called to speak, and she had not wanted to come, and she came anyway. I want to correct something, she began, because if this assembly is going to reclassify my species, I would prefer it did so for the right reason. She had no charts this time. For 11 years, I have listened to people call us resilient. I have listened to people call us tough and adaptable and unbreakable, and I have listened to a great many speeches in which those words were meant as compliments. They are not compliments, they are a diagnosis. The chamber was very quiet. Every one of you optimized. You found a food that was safe and you perfected it. That was not stupidity. It was the correct decision, made repeatedly by intelligent people, and it produced 900 years of excellent nutrition and almost no foodborne illness anywhere in settled space. Your systems were better than ours by every measure that mattered, right up until the moment they were not. She let that sit. We never optimized because we were never allowed to. Our world killed us in 100 different ways, and none of them consistently. Drought here, flood there, blight in one valley and locusts in the next. A human population that put its faith in one crop died. It happened over and over. It happened to millions. What survived was not the clever ones or the strong ones. What survived was the ones who ate 9 things instead of 1, and who kept a jar of something salted in the cellar for no reason they could explain. Rao looked up at the gallery. You're about to call us apex predators. Fine, but understand what that means. An apex predator is not the strongest animal in the system. It is the animal that nothing above it ever forced to be careful. We eat this way because nothing ever specialized us. We eat this way because the universe tried 100 different methods on us and could not settle on one, and so we could not settle on one either. She sat down. Ambassador Olan spoke after her, and he was 71 and near the end of his service, and what he said was shorter. Dr. Rao is right, and she is also being generous, he said, so let me be less generous. We laughed at them. I want that in the record. 11 years ago this chamber laughed for 4 minutes at a list of things a woman kept in a cupboard, and I did not laugh, but only because I was drafting an apology on their behalf, which is worse. We were not cruel. We were something more embarrassing than cruel. We were certain. He paused. Every fact we had was correct. The mold was alive. The fish was poison. Warden Tepper's report was accurate on every page. We had all the information, and we arranged it into a joke, because the alternative was a question, and the question was, what does it take to make a species like that? He looked around the chamber. We know now, vote how you like. I would only ask that when you go home tonight, you eat something you chose. The vote passed. It hardly mattered. What mattered was on Halden Reach, where the war had started, and where the first culinary academy open to non-human students was built on the foundation of a decommissioned synthesis plant. Nora Bell ran it. She was 59 and she had not wanted to run anything, and she had been talked into it by Tepper, who had retired from inspection and now taught food safety in a way that no health authority in settled space had ever taught it, which was practically with her hands over a fire. The first class had 11 students from 11 species and 11 completely different sets of tolerances, and Nora's opening lesson was the same one she had given every apprentice for 30 years. There's only one rule in this room, she said. Taste it, then decide. A Hess student asked whether that was safe. No, Nora said. That's why you check first, and why you learn the chemistry, and why Warden Tepper is going to spend 6 weeks teaching you what will actually kill you, and you are going to take that seriously. But after that, after you know, she held up a spoon, after that you don't get to have an opinion about a thing you haven't tasted, not in my kitchen. Velik came for the opening. He was 118 by then, and he had retired from engineering, and he had, for reasons he had never fully explained, spent his pension on a small farm. He brought the salt. He always brought the salt. It had become a joke between them, and then it had stopped being a joke and become something closer to a ritual, and now it was simply the thing Velik did. The Academy's opening meal was served at one long table in what had been the plant's loading floor. There were 60 people at it from more than 20 species, and every single dish had been calibrated to a different biology, some of them diluted 10,000 times, some of them served at temperatures that would have been lukewarm to a human and were the outer edge of possible for the diner in front of them. None of it had come out of a vat. All of it had been made by hand, from things that had once been dangerous, by people who had learned how to make dangerous things into dinner. Olan sat near the middle. He was very old and he ate slowly, and he watched the room more than he watched his plate. Near the end, he leaned over to Nora and asked the question he had been carrying for 11 years. Did you intend any of this? Nora thought about it honestly, because he deserved an honest answer. She thought about a survey ship and a pan and a piece of meat she had saved for 3 weeks. She thought about a quarantine door and an engineer standing on the other side of it. She thought about 400 delegates laughing and about a children's song and about a grain of salt on a clean white plate. No, she said, I thought everyone deserved to eat something worth eating. That was the whole idea. That was all of it. Olan nodded slowly. Down the table somebody laughed at something, and a Drammen student was arguing with a Hess student about whether bitterness was pleasant or merely interesting. And Teppa was standing at the far end with a knife in her hand, showing 3 people how to break down a fish without touching the part that would kill them. The plates went around, the bowls came back empty. Outside, the northern plains of Halden Reach were full of a root that had been called inedible for 200 years, and in the fields beyond the city there were 9 different crops growing, because that was the standard now, and the standard had a name, and the name was a place where 400,000 people had starved in front of full cupboards. Nobody at the table was laughing at what humans ate. They were too busy eating it.